A city had a cobra problem. The streets of colonial Delhi were overrun with venomous snakes and people were dying. The British government looked at the problem and decided the solution was straightforward. They would pay a bounty for every dead cobra brought in. A clean incentive. Kill a cobra, get paid. The cobra population would fall, the deaths would stop, and the problem would be solved. Within months, the cobra population was rising. Not because the bounty wasn't working, because it was working perfectly. The citizens of Delhi had started breeding cobras to collect the reward. This is the Cobra Effect, and it is not a story about stupidity. It is a story about what happens every single time a solution is aimed at a problem without understanding the system the problem lives inside. The phrase itself was coined by the German economist Horst Siebert, who used the colonial India story as the opening of a 2001 book about the unintended consequences of well-designed policy. Siebert did not invent the concept. He named something that had been happening since the first time a man tried to change a complex system by pulling on a single lever. The British colonial administration in Delhi was not incompetent. The people who designed the bounty program were educated, organized, and working from a logic that was internally sound. Cobras are dangerous. Dead cobras are not dangerous. Pay for dead cobras, get fewer dangerous cobras. The reasoning was clean. It failed because it treated the cobra population as a static fact rather than a dynamic system. The moment the bounty existed, cobras stopped being only a threat and became also a resource. The people living alongside them were rational. They responded to the incentive the government had created. They bred the resource, collected the reward, and when the British administration discovered what was happening and canceled the program in disgust, the breeders released their now worthless stock into the streets. Delhi ended up with more cobras than it had started with. The solution had produced the problem it was designed to solve. This pattern has a structure. It always has the same structure. A measurable symptom is identified. A reward or punishment is attached directly to that symptom. The system being managed responds to the reward or punishment rather than to the underlying problem. The symptom changes. The underlying problem does not. In the worst cases, the underlying problem gets worse because resources that would have addressed it are now being spent on the management of a metric that has detached from the reality it was meant to represent. The economist Charles Goodhart identified the same architecture in 1975, working on monetary policy in Britain. He was not studying cobras. He was studying what happened when the Bank of England began using specific statistical measures of the money supply as targets for policy. What he found was that the moment any statistical regularity became a target, it ceased to be a reliable statistic. The system being measured reorganized itself around the measurement. The metric stopped being a window into the reality it had described. It became a game. Goodhart's observation became Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. It is one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the history of economics. And it is, at its core, the Cobra Effect, stated in the language of academic policy. You identify something real. You attach a consequence to a number that describes that thing. The number moves, the thing does not. This influence on reality demands reflection. The failure mode is not corruption. It is not laziness. It is not even bad intentions. The failure mode is the gap between what a metric measures and what it was meant to represent, combined with the fact that any sufficiently motivated system will find and exploit that gap without being asked to. The cobra breeders were not criminals. They were farmers who noticed an opportunity. The banks that restructured their balance sheets to hit the numbers regulators had targeted were not vandals. They were institutions responding to the incentive structure they had been given. The schools that spent months drilling students on the specific format of standardized tests rather than teaching them to think were not betraying education. They were administrators trying to survive in a system that had defined success as a score. In every case, someone had measured something real, attached a meaningful consequence to it, and then watched the reality drift away from the measurement while the measurement continued to look fine. The examples run across every domain man has tried to manage with numbers. In the 1990s, the British government introduced performance targets for hospital waiting times. Patients waiting more than 4 hours in accident and emergency departments were a problem the data had clearly identified. The target was simple. No patient should wait more than 4 hours. Within a few years, hospitals had achieved dramatic improvements in the 4-hour metric. They had also developed an informal practice of keeping patients in ambulances outside the hospital rather than admitting them until the department had capacity. An admitted patient started the clock. A patient still in the ambulance did not. The 4-hour number improved. The experience of being a sick person in an ambulance idling outside a hospital did not. In the 1980s and 1990s, aid organizations working in developing countries began measuring the success of their programs by the number of people reached. Reach was quantifiable. Reach could be put in a report. Reach could be shown to donors. Organizations that reached more people received more funding. Organizations that reached fewer people received less, regardless of whether the people they reached had actually been helped. The incentive selected for scale. Scale selected against programs that were slow, expensive, and difficult but actually worked, and selected for programs that were fast, cheap, and visible but produced little lasting change. The metric had been a reasonable proxy for impact when it was first used. It became a replacement for impact once consequences were attached to it. In the early 2000s, several major banks were compensating loan officers based on the volume of mortgages they originated. More loans meant higher bonuses. The quality of those loans was a separate department's problem. The incentive selected for volume. Speed selected against the scrutiny that might have flagged a borrower who could not sustain the payments. The metric looked like productivity. What it was producing beneath the surface was an accumulation of risk so vast that when it unwound, it took the global economy with it. The British government paid for dead rats in Hanoi during the colonial period and discovered that Vietnamese workers were cutting off rat tails and releasing the rats to breed more tails. The French government in colonial Vietnam had run the same program in an earlier decade. Same incentive. Same result. Two administrations. Different flags. Identical farm. The structure does not care who runs it. This is what the conventional narrative leaves out. People encounter the Cobra Effect as a collection of darkly funny historical anecdotes. A parable about bureaucratic incompetence, a reason to distrust government or management or whoever designed the policy being mocked. That interpretation is comfortable because it locates the failure in a person or an institution rather than in a structural feature of how complex systems respond to being managed. But Siebert and Goodhart and the researchers who have spent careers cataloging these failures were not writing cautionary tales about bad administrators. They were describing a property of complex systems that is entirely independent of the intelligence or intentions of the people trying to manage them. A complex system has more moving parts than any measurement can capture. When you attach a consequence to one part, the rest of the system adjusts. The adjustment is not random. It follows the incentive. And the incentive, almost by definition, was designed to describe a portion of the system, not the whole thing. The gap between the slice and the whole is where the cobras breed. Siebert himself was not arguing that measurement is futile or that incentives never work. His actual argument was more uncomfortable than that. He was arguing that the design of an incentive system requires understanding the system being incentivized at least as well as the people inside it understand it, which is to say, from the inside, with full knowledge of every alternative action available to every actor in response to the new rule. That is an almost impossible standard. Siebert knew it. His recommendation was not to stop measuring. It was to treat every new incentive as a hypothesis rather than a solution, to watch what the system does in response, to ask not only whether the metric is moving, but whether the reality behind it is moving with it, to assume the system will find the gap, because it always does, and to look for the gap before the farm has been running long enough to matter. The British administrators in Delhi had a Cobra problem. They solved it with logic. The logic was correct. The system it was applied to was not the system they thought they were in. There are cobras being bred right now inside the response to whatever solution was most recently introduced to whatever problem you are watching. The question is not whether the incentive has been gamed. It has been gamed. The question is whether anyone is watching what is happening on the ground while the metric on the dashboard continues to look exactly like progress. By the time the count comes back worse than when you started, the snakes are already in the streets.